Okay, great. So today we are going to hear from Dr. Sarah Keenan from the School of Law at Birkbeck and PhD student Jenny Logan, who will be discussing why property is more interesting than it seems. Sarah, as I said, works at Birkbeck Law School. Her work sits at the intersection of legal and political thought, geography, feminist theory, and postcolonial studies. She has a particular interest in the widely expansive and politically potent concept of property. And before coming to academia, she worked as a judge's associate and a lawyer. Jenny is a Mphil/PhD student in law at Birkbeck, where she researches the intersections of race, sexual violence, and property through the lens of critical legal geography. Jenny is an attorney and has been a visiting professor at the University of Oregon School of Law, a special education teacher in the Bronx in New York, a Kill Rock Stars recording artist, a staff writer for Mad in America, and an advocate and organizer for the rights of immigrants, incarcerated persons, and houseless and low-income tenants. So with that, I will hand over to Sarah and Jenny. And thank you so much both for agreeing to do this and for being here today.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thanks, Naomi.
Sarah, I don't know if you want to start. I mean, we had like some questions planned, but then the Jackson versus Dobbs decision came down this morning from evening for you. So maybe we could talk about that, or we could talk a little bit about property first.
Well, yeah, I mean, I am happy to talk about property with you, but maybe we can come to that, because I feel like the decision that's just come down overturning Roe v. Wade, and everyone, I think even in the UK and Australia, where I had my legal education, where we don't say a party v. a party, everyone says Roe v. Wade, because it's the Americanism. Roe versus Wade has just been overturned, which we kind of knew was going to happen, but it still feels sort of quite shocking and upsetting that has just happened. And so I want to talk about it, if that's okay. I want to ask you about it. I mean, I am also, it's a pretty sort of intimate discussion today anyway, and I think that some of the people here will be interested in that, and I'm happy to think about it. And I do think about it in like through the lens of thinking about the objectification of women's bodies and like what it means to, in proprietal terms, to have reproductive freedom. But yeah, would that be okay? Because you're in the US now, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because I read the leaked opinion back in May, but I knew it was coming, I guess, but I'm still like a lot more upset than I thought I would be this morning, having found out about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel similarly. So I didn't read the leaked opinion. I just read summaries of the leaked opinion. I guess in part because I'm not an American lawyer, so I don't. Is that okay? Can I ask you some questions about this?
Yeah, of course. So,
well, first of all, I guess just for anyone who doesn't know, so my understanding is Roe versus Wade is it was a Supreme Court decision, a common law decision that it wasn't so much that it guaranteed access to abortion, but it prevented the states from criminalizing it completely. Yeah. Is that right? Can you explain Roe versus Wade to us? And what I've sort of not understood is why access to abortion depends on a common law decision, and why the federal government in the US can't just like legislate access, apart from that it wouldn't be politically palatable, which is maybe the answer. But can you tell me that?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people have been wondering that, like, why? Because Congress could have legislated access, and it's just never happened. And we had since like 1972 to do so, right, or even before that, right? Yeah. But so Roe basically said, yeah, you can't impose what the court calls an undue burden on abortion access, which they took to mean you can't criminalize it up until basically viability, which is like when they think like a fetus could survive on its own, potentially outside of the womb, which it tends to be interpreted as the third trimester. And I may be kind of fudging Roe with this other case from the 90s called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, because that's when Roe was like reconsidered in that case, and it was affirmed by sort of like a mixed plurality of justices. So it's been kind of on shaky ground, which is why a lot of people think like, why didn't Congress just protect this right? Because it was already since the 90s sort of like fuzzy, right? It didn't provide a very clear like legal mandate of access, because like even Casey, like they struck down this requirement that a woman had to inform her husband before she could get an abortion, but they didn't strike down this. It was a Pennsylvania state law, and it had a bunch of like kind of barriers to getting abortion. One of them was this like husband notification requirement, but they didn't have it for unmarried women, so they struck that down.
Sorry, what year was that?
That was, I think, 94, 92 or 94.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. But they didn't strike down a requirement saying like a minor has to get parental permission. So there were already like a lot of potential obstacles. And in some states, like women had to travel really far to get an abortion or have like a 24-hour waiting period. So it was like legal in some sense, but not necessarily like accessible, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was Roe against Wade, and so is it that Congress didn't legislate because it wouldn't have passed because it's too, like, it would have been too hard to get it through as a piece of legislation?
I think so, but there have been times when, you know, the Democrats controlled the House and Senate, but they didn't, you know, but I think it's an issue that maybe crosses party lines. And here my dog might make an appearance in a second. Let's see.
Great.
So I don't know if you want to talk about sort of what you mentioned at the beginning about like the property implications of this decision, but I'd be interested to hear your take about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear your take on that. So this decision overturns Roe v. Wade, so which just means that now states are not prevented from putting, I can't remember the wording, undue impediments or something to accessing abortion, which now means that conservative states will put those obstacles in, and that's basically what's going to happen now.
Yeah. I mean, the at least the leaked opinion I read, which I imagine the final opinion is not that different, basically says, look, there's no right to an abortion protected in the Constitution, which means that it's not just that we can't have an undue burden. You can just criminalize it outright. So there are states now with laws that were just kind of, I think they're called like trigger laws or something, where they were just waiting for this decision to come down, and now they're going to completely criminalize it. Yeah, but the Mississippi law that was at issue in this case, the Dobbs versus Jackson, they just wanted to ban abortions after 15 weeks, which was like before the third trimester, and that's how it got there. But the decision basically says like there's no constitutional right, and that's, I think, where maybe some property implications come in, right? Like they because the Roe decision found a right to privacy in the Constitution, sort of reading between the lines. And that's often sort of, I mean, the thing, you had also asked me like what made me become interested in property. And one of the things is that like, as a lawyer, like really the only way to cognize any kind of injury is as a form of property. And so, right. And so, I mean, and that goes for sexual violence cases, which is what I'm researching, but also like in the case of abortion, like it was cognized as this property right to privacy, basically. And so it was sort of the abortion controversy was framed in terms of the states taking away a woman's right to this sort of protected privacy interest. And what Alito is saying is basically like, that's not there because the Constitution doesn't use the word abortion. And there wasn't, like, at the time of the framing, there wasn't a right to an abortion. So it couldn't be what the framers had meant.
Yeah.
Which is very disingenuous, I think, because there's a lot of stuff there's a lot of rights that the Supreme Court has sort of like pulled out of the Constitution without it being like textually there. Like,
of course.
Gay marriage, for example, or like other things. So.
Or like the meaning of arms, like that, you know, AK-47s weren't invented when the Constitution was being written either, but like, can't you buy them? I don't know, isn't that like a constitutionally protected right?
Even judicial review, like the Supreme Court's power to sort of have the final word on what the Constitution means, isn't written in the Constitution. That's something they decided in the 1800s. So I find it very sort of political and disingenuous for him to say that, oh, well, it's not written there, so it can't exist, right?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I feel really upset. I feel really upset about it. Although I'm not directly affected because I don't live in the US, it just absolutely is like such a blatant attack on people who can get pregnant, you know, women and trans men. And it feels like it does feel like war. There is. I feel a sense of urgency and devastation about it. Which must be way more potent for you where you are. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's so interesting to me that it was framed in terms of a right to privacy. I didn't know that. I read that that Roe v. Wade somehow founded in the Constitution, but I don't know American constitutional law, so I didn't know it was the right to privacy. Yeah, that is interesting. And yeah, what you say about you know, how you became interested in property, it's sort of similar to me in a way, I guess. Like I never had an interest in real estate, although I've kind of developed one, you know, from a political economy kind of perspective. And obviously I live in London and gentrification is like very real and obvious. And I'm from Australia. And so thinking about what is done to land is very obviously political. When I started, well, how I got into it actually was I started my PhD thinking about refugee rights, actually, refugee decisions, and in particular refugee decisions based on sexuality, persecution, and in particular the claims made by women, which tended to be less legible to refugee decision makers in the jurisdictions I was looking at, which are basically, you know, like let's call them like capitalist jurisdictions, or like, the global north. And I found that, I mean, I was really concerned about that issue politically, because in Australia in the early 2000s, or actually it was when 9/11 happened, that Australia began sending refugees who were attempting to arrive in Australia by boat to small Pacific islands, and detaining them there, eventually indefinitely, but for very long periods of time under conditions that the UN has repeatedly found to constitute torture. But so yeah, it was that the boat that was intercepted was still at sea when the 9/11 attacks happened, and so there was this very quickly escalating and extreme Islamophobia sort of built into Australian discourse and law, and that was sort of like the most urgent political issue for me. But then when I started looking at refugee law, I just found that most kind of critical takes were very liberal, and the kind of height of what you could argue for was an expansion in the categories of refugees. And what I wanted to do was to think much more kind of fundamentally about what was happening here, and how it is that particular bodies are rendered so out of place, or they can't belong to such an extreme level that this kind of violence is acceptable. And I just ended up thinking about it in terms of property, and in terms of, in particular, what constitutes a subject and what constitutes an object, what's the relationship between them. And then once I started thinking about that, I saw, I guess, like conceptual overlaps between property and borders, obviously, but then I just saw it everywhere as well. Like,
right.
It just, yeah.
I was say, like, once you start thinking about it in one context, you kind of start to see it everywhere. I've found anyway.
Yeah. And I mean, but I think it is everywhere. I think, property is such a expansive term and concept. Like, it's used to mean so many different things, and people do really mean very different things by them. But if we think about it from its sort of Anglo-European philosophical roots of being about a relationship between a subject and an object, and a relationship that makes the subject, like constitutes the subject through that relationship to the object. I mean, it's really hard to look at any political issue, I think, and it'd be outside of that. Including what's happening now, like in terms of so I mean, I guess to try and like relate these conversations, I mean, these conversations are related, and I think you can probably do a better job at this than me, because today's decision like relates more clearly to your research than it has to mine. But I guess if I was trying to sort of apply the way I was thinking about property in my book to the Dodd decision, I would see this taking away of reproductive freedom from bodies that can reproduce, from women and trans men, as a taking of their subversive property. So in that bodies that can reproduce are subversive of like the patriarchal system of control that is required to reproduce ideas of kinship and family and property that are so central to the kind of social fabric of the nation state of the US, I think. I mean, I say this as someone who knows very little about the US, except that, I live in the world in 2022. So we're all subject to American culture in fairly high levels. But and I mean, there's heaps of literature on this, of course, of, it's always, and whether it's, going back to Federici, and it's the introduction of capitalism requires the control of women's bodies and bodies that can reproduce in order to structure a society in which reproductive labor happens at home for free, and productive labor or paid labor happens somewhere else in a public sphere. So control of those bodies is important to power, and therefore those bodies have subversive potential. Reproductive freedom is seen as a a problem for power. And I mean, it is a problem for power. I think if we, and I mean, the property is relevant here as well. I think if, you know, if we think about property, not just in terms of real estate, but in terms of the dynasties of families that clearly still exist. I mean, look at, you know, Trump, and like the bloodline is still so relevant. Yeah, so I would see this decision as a taking of that subversive property from those bodies, and that it's not just about those bodies, of course, although reading it in a subversive property way, for me, is an attempt to see women and trans men's bodies as not just the victim of this, but as like having something that is powerful, that there is an attempt now to take that away. And that's not just about them, it's about something much broader in terms of the kind of political, physical space of the US today. It's like a shaping of that space, which of course it will be in very material terms, in terms of, you know, shutting down clinics and what it means for, in particular, people who have less resources and live in states that make it more difficult for them to access a safe abortion. These will have really like obvious consequences in terms of the sort of political geography of what, you know, what things look like now.
Yeah, I mean, I also see it on this sort of continuum of like, I mean, Sophie Lewis, who I'll shout out, who I think we both know, like has a book about pregnancy as being like forced. I mean, forced pregnancy is forced gestational labor, right? And like, yeah, and that links with like Federici, who talks about forced social reproduction. And then, I mean, I see it happening now at a time when there is more and more like people unionizing in the United States, and there's more people leaving their jobs, and it's caused this sort of like, there's sort of a cultural crisis about people who like, oh, nobody wants to work anymore, but like wages are at a like very, very below poverty level. And I see this as sort of, this decision is coming as like, well, here's one more mechanism of control to ensure that we have like a huge population of available laborers who will fight to like lower the wage, basically.
Yeah. Yes. And yeah, I mean, related to that, and I mean, I think this is Sophie's project now, right, is looking at, I mean, there've long been calls from feminists to abolish the nuclear family, and thinking about that in a contemporary context. And I mean, that also relates to your work, right, in terms of thinking about children as property, and I guess property as the overarching framework of the family. Like, is that, yeah, can you, sorry, I'm making this very, very, I'm asking you questions as well. I know that that's meant to go the other way, but yeah, I mean, so I'll say that I've been listening and reading quite a lot of Kim Tallbear recently. Do you know her stuff?
I know her name, but I don't know her.
Yeah, she's an amazing scholar, native scholar who sort of Indigenous science and technology studies, and thinks about the problem of defining, I guess, membership of Native groups by DNA testing, in particular. But then she's also like she blogs at the Critical Polyamorist, and she's thinking about like alternative forms of kinship and family, and yeah, I guess like the nuclear family as a settler colonial imposition, which is of course also, yeah, related to property, because once you have the nuclear family as a requirement of that's the basis of social organization, then having you know, private property in an urban block follows soon after that, as opposed to Indigenous forms of landholding that might be more collective and just conceptualized actually really quite differently, both in terms of how the land is understood, but also in terms of how the community that lives with the land is understood. So yeah, can you like, are you also for the abolition of the nuclear family, or like, do you see like possibilities in other kinship structures, or how do we get away from children as property and that sort of oppressive family structure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I would say I am and I'm not. Like I'm for it, but I'm for it because of something else. Like I think we need, I'm more for abolishing sort of like the economic structures of the family and I've kind of had this conversation with Sophie, like not very well, but I think that nuclear families exist that are fine, right? Like that aren't necessarily exploitative or that treat each other like property. But I think there's something about all the economic incentives that sort of trap people inside of a nuclear family and encourage like marriage and encourage home ownership and things like that. Very often usually conspire to this sort of property form, right? If that makes sense. So I don't think like a living arrangement that is like two like biological parents and a group of children is necessarily going to be like hold people in this structure of subject object, if that makes sense, where the children become property. But I do think that it likely will happen given like our like political economy. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I guess what I'm wondering is whether it's possible to separate the two, except conceptually. Like, you know, like because I agree, of course, you know, I know some nice families, I think, but I mean, you don't really, do you, until you're in them. Can you separate the nuclear family structure from the economy in which it operates?
Maybe not. Yeah. Although at least like as a political project, I still think that like changing the economics of it is more important than saying like nuclear families shouldn't exist, I guess, if that makes sense, like as a framing, if there's a framing of the problem at least. But yeah, I mean, you also, I was thinking this week about how I got interested in property, because you had asked me that over email. And I think like, for me, the beginning was like being a kid and feeling like, oh, I'm regarded as someone's property. Do you know what I mean? Like, I am like treated as the property of these adults. And then like I left home when I was pretty young and I was sort of couch surfing and didn't really have like my own home. And I think like that also solidified how your relationship to property really determines like what kind of person you can be. And like, you know, I didn't really have the language of like the subject at the time, you know? But like from an experiential point of view, and I sort of like became friends with some squatters and anarchists. And so that was like sort of the beginning of my political education, I think, like as it, like to whatever extent it was. But it definitely sort of shaped how I thought about how contingent our like just being in the world is, depending on like if you have a home to go back to, or like if you can sort of claim a place of ownership, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting that you, even as a child, felt like like the property of your adult caretakers, I guess. I think there's something, I mean, this is something we haven't really talked about that much yet in your work, but I think you are thinking about is like, I guess there's two aspects of children as property, and one is that you're an object, and your sort of legal agency or subjectivity isn't legally recognized, and so you're under the control of your parents, and you're owned by them in that way. But then also, there's something psychoanalytic about the relationship between parent and child, and that you as a child are encouraged to be a kind of trophy for to fulfill your parents' sense of self. Like there's also that kind of object relation, I think. I mean, I know less about this, but I think they're both at play, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of, I feel like there's so many different valences of objectification that you can kind of draw different, like psychoanalytic theory, and then like different theories. And I do think, I mean, I'm not interested in trying to like define all of them, but I do think they all are related in some way to property and space.
Yeah.
But maybe this is a good segue for me to ask you another question, because I wanted to ask you about thinking about space, because we've talked about property mostly, but I want to read a quote from your book, which says, because you encourage us to think spatially about property, and this quote says, thinking spatially about property brings complex connections between space, time, and the subject into view, demonstrating that those connections not only constrain and empower, but also constitute the subject. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. I wrote this so long ago, but I still, I'm still okay with that. Something Kim Tallbear said in one of the podcasts I've listened to with her recently. I think she was quoting Donna Haraway, where she said that as academics, it's good if we don't try to be right, but we try to be less wrong. Like if we just keep so I feel like that's not too wrong. Like that's okay. That statement. But yeah, so thinking, my desire to think about property spatially, I guess, came from reading the sort of classic philosophical justificatory texts for property, which, I mean, tend to be Locke and Hegel, who are very different writers, but both foundational to, I guess, Anglo-European Enlightenment thought, in terms of the model of the liberal subject that emerges after that time. And there's a lot written about property. I mean, there's so much, right, written about property, and from a philosophical point of view, and even the more critical stuff, I guess, I found tends to, I mean, I guess understandably, just really focus in on the subject-object relation, which of course I'm also fascinated by, but I wanted to be a bit less abstract about it, I guess, and think about how the subject and object don't exist in a vacuum, but they exist in a physical, social, cultural context, which I guess at the time I called space, and I probably still would, although, and maybe we'll get onto this, like I've been thinking about time more now as well. But yeah, I wanted to, I guess for political reasons, I wanted to think about not just the constitution of the subject through its relation to the object, but the constitution of the subject through the space in which the subject is created, and in which the subject continues to be reproduced as a subject constantly. So not sort of taking the subject and object as ontological givens that are kind of stable and permanent, although and outside of just their relation to each other, but to think about them in a much broader context. And I found, and so what I'm arguing there is that, that the subject and the object, subjectivity and objectivity, are not predefined and essential. They're reproduced constantly. We reproduce them constantly. What subjectivity means, I think, just in terms of land ownership, that's changed a lot. I think that's changed. I mean, that's absolutely changed a lot. If we just look at the kind of post-British Empire context in which all of us here are implicated, like, in the foundations of property and land are feudal, and to have land, the subjectivity that you inhabited, you were an aristocrat. You gained very unique access to the formal structures of power. You had loads of privileges and rights that came with that. Now, land ownership is not just the realm of the aristocracy. It's much more widely available, though still, massively racialized and fairly gendered, but mainly there are massive lines along race that mean that if you're not white, you're less likely to own land. However, with the expansion of the category of land ownership into the lower realms of society that weren't allowed it before, the meaning of what it is to be a landowner has also changed. And it doesn't give you this unique access. You're not sitting in the House of Lords because you own land. In fact, because of the proliferation of mortgage finance, you're kind of, to a great extent, controlled by a different force now. And property has come to mean something else. So, that's why I wanted to think about. That's why I was thinking spatially, I guess, was I was fascinated by, I guess, the kind of metaphysics of the subject and object, but I still am, and I think it's a really crucial relation that is everywhere. But in order to escape that, aside from just a kind of project of redistribution along the same kind of categories that we have, like, let's just dish it out differently, I wanted to think at a more fundamental level about how subjectivity and objectivity are created, in order as well to feel like it's possible for them to shift.
I feel like even in hearing you talk about space, like you are still like, I mean, when we talk about reproduction, we're talking about something that happens in time too. So like time is already always like kind of built into our conversations about like reproduction and even space, I think. I mean, like my sister is a physicist and she just talks in terms of space-time. So like I like, from that perspective, it doesn't seem like they could be separated, right? And so I think it's sort of a natural progression then, right, for you to start be thinking about time now.
Yes, absolutely. That's so interesting. Your sister's a physicist. I mean, I was thinking about, well, I did physics at school actually, and I was quite good at it, but I don't know anything at all anymore. But I was thinking about whether we can think about the subject and object as a kind of metaphysical, whether that's like the metaphysics of something, but then so is space and time. And so what we're kind of, I feel like property is a way to think about like metaphysics at a kind of philosophical and political level. But the interaction between space and time, absolutely. I mean, I kind of got there in obvious way of falling in love with Doreen Massey's work. You know, she's a feminist geographer who sadly died, a British geographer, sadly died a few years ago now, but who wrote about space in such compelling and optimistic terms about it being not just the kind of dead matter that time happens over the top of, but as itself alive and constitutive of everything, including subjectivity. But how she came to define space, I guess, I mean, not that she'd want to define it in like a sentence or a formula, but I do think that from her book For Space, you can use the formula of dynamic, heterogeneous, simultaneity, which are her three key elements. And I mean, dynamic, that's about time, right? That's about movement. Heterogeneous is about having a lot of things, so it's not necessarily about time. But simultaneity, that's also a temporal term. So in her understanding of space, which I, you know, just fully, fell in love with and kind of embraced for my project, was so temporal that I couldn't then not think about time. And then you're right that, like, in an applied way in the world, of course you can't think about space without time. Like, reproductive justice is a clear example. Also, just like on a really boring level, you know, what does it mean to have, this isn't necessarily boring, but what does it mean to have property in land? It means to own a slice of time in the land. And if it's a freehold, that slice of time is indefinite. If it's a leasehold, it's definite. So yeah, space and time are absolutely inseparable. And I guess they're just kind of like two vectors of understanding the world, and what constitutes the world. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to go back to something you said about like your research being about sort of shifting these categories, right? The categories, as I understand it, maybe like force us into roles of subject and object as opposed to something else. So I'm kind of wondering what you think, if you have an idea of like how your work could inform a political practice, or
oh yes, I saw that question. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess let's see. I mean, I guess my work on space and property, what I had hoped to achieve politically, and I guess my remaining hope for how it could be used in terms of political practice, was to, I mean, and there's lots of other work that does this as well, but is to move away from a kind of liberal politics of identity that relies on victimization as the kind of key currency in which to trade, by thinking about victimized identities as actually sources of power, sources of property, of belonging to something that is politically potent and potentially disruptive, and of saying that, you know, if property relations are of course not fixed, but beyond that, what counts as property? Like what is proper in a space, like what is kind of upheld as legitimate relations of belonging and exclusion within a applied context, that isn't fixed either. And by putting bodies that are out of place and making them stay there, or like, I mean, but bodies obviously that are inhabited by amazing people who create alternative communities and resist persistently and in kind of well-structured ways that have chances at longevity, that can really do something, like that can that can become proper in a space. You can, and I mean, those kinds of alternative spaces do exist. I mean, you talked about squatting before. You know, if you go into particular kinds of political squats, you know, what is proper to those spaces, and you know, who and what belongs in those spaces is not what is proper outside of those spaces, and who and what belongs, and that's defined by the very terms of their tenure, right? Like they are, they're on a form of possession that's seen as adverse. And I mean, I would argue that all possession is adverse, right? Because it's adverse to someone, and certainly in a settler colonial context, all possession is adverse unless it's by Indigenous people, and even Indigenous people who are property owners would not have, prior to colonialism, seen their relationship as one of possession. But at any rate, yeah, so I guess I was trying to think with sort of optimism around what is possible in that way. And then I think my attempts to think about property differently and in a way that is applicable beyond the kind of formal questions of property in terms of just like title to land. I was hoping to bring together political and legal contexts that are usually thought very separately, and I mean, in particular, borders and property. So
yeah, my next question was going to be like, to what extent do you think law matters, right? Because you've talked about sort of how we might change space, but like there's no squatting without property law, right?
Yeah.
So to like, what am I trying to ask you? Like, there's ways of being subversive, but it's always sort of tied to the law. And I'm wondering, like, to what extent does changing the law make a difference? Or what do you think is a good political target, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't really know the answer. I mean, I guess like the answer is multifaceted in that, of course, law matters. Like, you know, it's the socially sanctioned violence of the state is behind the law, and so that matters. Then again, a lot of realities exist outside of and in defiance of the law, and whether our kind of, whether a kind of radical political goal should be to change the law or to get rid of it completely is, you know, it's one of those, I feel like that's a question for my colleagues who are constitutionalists. You know, like if you get rid of the system, what do you replace it with? Like where if you overturn law, you know, something as kind of broad and foundational as the kind of sovereign-based system of law that we have, what do you replace it with? And I mean, I would never ask that question, of course, because I don't think you need to have an answer to have a critique. I think it's that thing, like, you know, like Mari Matsuda said, quoting Angela Davis, is that, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's like, you know, sometimes we need to stand inside the courtroom and like argue for the application of the law in this way in the morning, and then in the afternoon we need to stand outside the courtroom and argue for the law to be abolished completely. And you know, and I think that, yeah, as a means of sort of political survival and strategy, that's always been the case. Like law is it's complicated because it's it's hard to not argue for reform, but then it's the case for abolition is compelling.
Right. Well, and even in that quote that you cited, she's using space and time to talk about when and where it's appropriate to like do different things, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we should see if people have questions. I just got a message.
Yeah, I just got that too. Yep. I don't know how this. Does anyone have a question?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I see Lizzie has their hand up.
Yeah. Will you chair, Naomi, or?
Yeah, happy to chair. Thank you both for such a amazing conversation. This is exactly like the kind of thing that I wanted to get out of this series. Yeah, so Lizzie, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for the conversation. It was really fun to watch and to listen to. I was wondering what both of your thoughts were on what the knock-on effect of the decision in the US will be in the UK and maybe other territories too, especially given that we know that increasingly the financially affluent American far right has roots in the UK, and we kind of see them emerging in the ongoing turf debates and that themselves have roots in anti-abortion movements. So, and we also know that abortion clinics in the UK already have people that protest outside of them. So I'm wondering whether you think there'll be kind of colloquial knock-on effects or potentially political and legal knock-on effects as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Lizzie.
You want to go, Jenny?
Yeah, sure. I mean, ideally, it would have the effect of sort of galvanizing pro-abortion forces to. I mean, I don't know the UK law. Is it? Because you all don't have a constitution per se, is that right?
Oh no, the British do have a constitution. It's just unwritten.
Right.
But I'm not very good either. I think abortion is allowed up to a particular point in time. I don't know whether there are, but I don't know whether you can. I think you can just go. I don't think you need to have a medical referral, or I should know this, but maybe Lizzie does or someone else does.
Well, I will say that, I mean, one of the things I'm seeing happening in the US that hopefully, and probably will also happen in the UK is that the states that do have legal abortion, like Oregon, where I've lived for a long time, you can get an abortion pill online and then just ship it to someone in a different state. So I know there are a lot of people mobilizing to help people in the states where it's becoming criminalized now to still have access to abortion.
Mm.
Granted, the pill only works within a certain amount of time. But
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Lizzie, I'd be just as keen to hear what you think on that question. I mean, I guess the one thing that's sort of heartening to me is that it was so recent that Ireland abolished the 8th, that battle was won. And although I know, and again, I should know more about this, but that the success of the vote hasn't necessarily turned into the kind of immediate access that feminists would have wanted. So that, I mean, on this side of the Atlantic, in the, a traditionally very Catholic nation state, where abortion access was so extremely limited, that's actually shifted in the other direction relatively recently. I think that's heartening, and that, I mean, the campaigns that occurred were really amazing, I think. And I mean, there's lots of great people, including some of my colleagues like Ruth Fletcher and Mairead Enright, who've written about that. Feminist law people are based in the UK, so that sort of gives me some hope, I guess, that we can, also learn from what's happened there, and ideally it will galvanize those pro-abortion networks that already exist. But I mean, you're right, Lizzie, about that, the far right and the extent of the TERF movement here. I don't know how those kinds of relationships and vectors of hate will shift now.
I'm tempted to say, I'd like to hear from Lizzie too, but I'm tempted to say it's not even, it's more than just being about abortion. Like it's just a hate of women. At least that's the feeling I get in the US. Because I use Planned Parenthood here, and like I've gone to get to Planned Parenthood to get like cancer cells removed, and I've still been yelled at by protesters. Like it doesn't matter. Like it's just women by themselves getting health care, I think, that people don't like, you know. So it's more it's more than just about abortion. It's something more fundamentally about like women's freedom, I think. Anyway.
I totally agree.
Lizzie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, I also agree. I think that it's a kind of deep-seated hatred of women, and I think, yeah, I mean, kind of thinking about it since I read it on BBC a couple of hours ago, I suppose. I guess because the UK doesn't have that kind of financially powerful, devout right. That's a different context there, and I also think that the government in the UK is probably invested in bolstering its own image and optics as a kind of quote unquote progressive place, and part of that might be distancing itself from the US in that way. But I also think that the deep hatred of women and pretty much everybody that isn't Boris Johnson will find other ways of coming out, that's for sure. It might not be through kind of changing abortion rules, but it'll you know, it appears in other ways, as we know. But yeah, and thanks for both of your answers. Sorry that I had to ask such a bleak question. But yeah,
get it.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie, and thanks both for your answers. We are slightly over time, but I did have a question of my own. And if Jenny and Sarah are okay to stay for a little while, do feel free to also ask questions. I mean, slightly different subject, but more so more to do with what you were talking about towards the end of your conversation. I was wondering what your thoughts, either of you, what your thoughts on the Indigenous land back movements in the United States and in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, and in Australia, Canada, places like that. What your sort of thoughts on those were, and how those movements might use the law or not use the law to you know, use other methods to win, you know, get wins in that particular cause.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something about that. I mean, yeah, I mean, I get the context that I know best is Australia, but I know some of, like, a little bit about similar movements in the other British settler colonies, mainly New Zealand, the US, and Canada. And yeah, I mean, it's great that Indigenous land back movements, as you term it, like people are talking about them in sort of quite wide circles now. What I would say is that Indigenous people have always demanded their land back. Like the land back movement is just a kind of you know, is historically where we are since Indigenous resistance began, since the first, like, settlers landed, and that, you know, so the Indigenous land movements have a really long history, and they have a really long history of how they engage with law. And whether they engage with law and how they understand law, both settler law and, of course, there's Indigenous law. So in Australia, which is in some senses the most legally repressive regime, in that Australian sovereignty is still really based on the idea that the land was empty, although that was recognised as factually incorrect in a decision from 1992. The basis of sovereignty is settlement, so there's no treaty at all with Indigenous people in Australia, whereas there are treaties with Indigenous people in the other British settler states, although of course the treaties have been broken and they were oppressive and like they're in not any ways kind of like perfect documents, but just the fact that they existed meant that there was some kind of recognition built into the kind of foundation of the nation state that there were people there, whereas in Australia there's not been a treaty, and there's a movement now for constitutional recognition and treaty, which is controversial amongst Aboriginal people, which of course it is because they have different opinions on things. And yeah, there are arguments, really, you know, compelling arguments, which I have a lot of empathy with, for the necessity of constitutional recognition and treaty as engagements with law. But then there are other Indigenous thinkers and activists who are against constitutional recognition because it's a means of inclusion within a violent state structure. And, you know, even the idea of treaty rests on an idea of sovereignty, which, although that's politically useful as well for Indigenous people, and a lot of Indigenous people claim sovereignty, sovereignty itself is an Anglo-European idea, and you know, the Indigenous ways of thinking and knowing the land, which of course have also evolved, weren't like the word sovereignty is, you know, is an English word. It's not. Yeah. So it's complicated, and I mean, sort of like, yeah, the conversation Jenny and I were just having about law, I guess it's complicated, and I think that it is necessary to use law strategically at times, while maintaining a structural critique of the violent foundations of law in a settler colonial context.
I don't really have anything to add to that, Sarah. That was great.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarah. So Juan has just had to go, but he said, thanks so much for the conversation. It's been very enlightening. I started to read Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, and your insight about the relation between property and the male-dominated society is essential to understand how the patriarchal system is deeply rooted. And yeah, he said it's great to listen to you both and have a nice weekend. I don't know if just before we end, if either of you wanted to sort of comment on that or respond at all.
No, I mean, I think it's great for everyone to read Federici. I think that, you know, Caliban and the Witch is a good kind of, there are critiques of it, of course, but I think it's a good place to start thinking about women and property. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, great. So again, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Sarah and Jenny, and thank you for such a brilliant conversation. As I said before, this is exactly the kind of thing that I was hoping to get out of these events. And thank you to our audience for coming as well and coming out on a Friday afternoon. Yeah. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, yeah. Naomi and Sarah and everyone.
Yeah, thanks Jenny and Naomi and everyone. Have a good weekend.
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
Bye.